Good day. You are listening to the podcast of Studio Central and Eastern Europe at KU Leuven. In our 20-minute episodes, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I am Njomëza, PhD researcher at KU Leuven in the Faculty of Architecture. And with me today is Vjosa Musliu, an associate professor of international relations at the political science department at Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Her research examines international state building and the political economy of liberal interventions in the Balkans. Vjosa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Njomëza. It's a great pleasure to be here for this podcast and to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Today we will talk about Vjosa's new book, Girlhood at War, Interpreting War and Liberation in Kosovo. The book narrates the story of a 12-year-old Vjosa growing up in wartime Kosovo and the immediate aftermath of NATO's intervention in 1999. I would like to start by saying that reading this book was a very special experience to me. Coming myself from Kosovo, I was only 1 year old when the war started, so I don't really have any personal memories of it. However, growing up, I was from time to time surrounded by war stories of my family members. And reading this book really, in a way, crystallized my image of it, for it is a book beyond statistics and complex timelines of events as we usually see it in history books, but it really tells the first-hand experiences of a young teenager as she remembers it. And I think it's a wonderfully told story that is universal and everyone can relate to it. Vjosa, could you elaborate more on why you chose to narrate this book in such a way that is told by a young girl? There are no explanations or written reflections on these memories, yet the reader can very much understand them. If I may read, as you wrote it on the preface of the book. As an academic, I dissociate from the girl and study what she remembers. At the same time, I give this girl tools and concepts to articulate sad memories in the form of short stories. So it is a very powerful way to narrate it through a young girl whose perception of the world is very straightforward. So Albanians as victims, Serbs as oppressors, and NATO as savior. If the book was written by an adult person, it would be much more nuanced and complex. And also at the same time, if you could explain what it means to write this book as an academic, so beyond the academic obligation to be neutral.
Thank you for the exposé, Njomëza. I will try to tackle both questions separately in the hope that I articulate properly the motivations behind it. First and foremost, the decision to write the book from the perspective of a preteen girl. So I was born in the mid-1980s in Kosovo, former Yugoslavia, and by the time that I had the chance to go to school, the so-called parallel life for Albanians in Kosovo started because towards the end of the 1980s, the former Yugoslav president, Slobodan Milosevic, had stripped off Kosovo's autonomy and essentially had installed an apartheid-like state for Kosovo Albanians. That also meant that suddenly the city spaces, but also schools, theaters, stadiums, even shopping malls, they became segregated places. That also meant that most of my schooling was done in house schools because education in Albanian language was almost banned officially. In the absence of proper schools, we turned private houses into home schools, and that's where my journey with education basically started and continued. So the reason to go back to the preteen girl, to the preteen self, is first and foremost historical, because that was my age when I was living in Kosovo at that time. But also because a lot of those stories as a preteen girl were systematically tucked away or hidden or somewhere stored either in my memory or in my body or in my worldviews as I grew up and later ended up studying, unsurprisingly, international relations and political science. And even though I continued to write and I studied very much aspects of peace and war studies, and I continued to write about the grand theories, the grand concepts about peace, liberation, and then post-war reconstruction, as we do in traditional political science, at least, or in traditional international politics, I was constantly uneasy because a big chunk of my embodied knowledge was not translatable in those grand concepts that had been designed, proliferated, developed in northwestern hemisphere of Europe and North America, with little to no resonance with my embodied experience as somebody who had both lived through the war, had seen the NATO bombing from the ground, and had also seen how liberation and post-war reconstruction takes place. So I felt a little bit both epistemically but also cognitively uneasy about the things that I was reading, both in my bachelor, but especially so in my master and my PhD when I moved to Northwestern Europe to pursue further my education.
What it means to write this book as an academic, so beyond the academic obligation to be neutral, because for young Vjosa, her perception was not neutral the way she's very unapologetically neutral in a way.
Yeah. Perhaps it is also good to clarify that even though I make that clarification at the outset of the book, the one that you read, where I say that I dissociate from the girl, but I give her tools and concepts to explain certain events that have happened to her and her family, I think this is always bound to be a slippery and complicated terrain. Even though I try to do as much justice to her memories, it is very clear that from the version of myself as a preteen girl to a professor who now teaches about the very same issues, there has been a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, which is equally important, into how to both make sense of those events on a personal level, but also on the political level. So even though indeed I give her the tools to explain all those events, it is very difficult to draw this Cartesian division of the academic who is knowledgeable in a different format about these issues and the young girl. Like, these are not detached. Even though I try to maintain the detachment as much as possible, I am also painfully aware that this distinction is and will always remain somewhat blurred. Why then writing this as an academic? I think a lot of the tension in the book, at least for those who come from the academic discipline that they will read, comes from the very disciplining contours that occur in each discipline, including the discipline of international relations, right? In international relations, in political science, traditionally speaking, legitimate and sound research is quintessentially associated with the ability to dissociate, to detach from the object of study. And this is unsurprising because, much like humanities, the social sciences as well derive quite a bit from natural sciences, in which it takes a solid detachment from the researcher who is dissecting a frog in a laboratory and understanding what is happening there. This kind of understanding of scientific inquiry has been also brought to social sciences, where you're supposed to be detached, and this is commonly referred to as being neutral to the object of study. And as somebody who was studying the very same processes that I had lived with, I was consistently uneasy with this forceful intervention of the discipline, because what this meant is that only certain subjects were now legitimate to talk about wars and peace, and suddenly you were susceptible to bias. You were usually targeted with, very well-meant suggestions of how to avoid your own biases, how to avoid your own subjectivity, essentially, to the field of study, which is, again, not suggestion. It's not a precaution that is given to all researchers equally. I have been in countless conferences where colleagues from Ukraine, Lebanon, or myself would be advised how to avoid bias because they are studying linguistic arrangements inside Lebanon, or they are studying Ukraine's relations with Russia. Whereas that same predicament, that same suggestion is not extended to my Belgian colleagues who study Belgium's development aid in the Congo or elsewhere, because somehow certain subjects of research, of knowledge production, are exempted from being biased. So this is only specifically associated to certain groups, and The second aspect of writing this as an academic, but again defying the traditional contours of academia, is because I insisted quite a lot on the narrative turn. And I was very glad to then discover journals such as Journal of Narrative Politics. A decade ago, that's when I first published a narrative piece about international politics. And then I was introduced to important scholars such as Aida Hozic, Naim Inayatullah, who were people who were shaping this kind of thinking in international relations. And by doing so, they were also opening the door to different epistemic subjects. So to subjects that were, quote unquote, biased, susceptible to bias, but who importantly had different kinds of embodied knowledge that would enrich the discipline. And then lastly, on a more political level, as a young scholar, it has always been a bit confronting and disconcerting to sit at conferences and listen to authoritative scholars talk about land swap agreements, territorial exchange, population exchanges with nauseating ease, as if they are, in a board game strategizing about lives of actual people. And the idea to humanize both war, to humanize the face of the liberation as well, but also sometimes to humanize those very same soldiers who, when they would barge into your own houses, they would go and take a little piece of bread because they were also hungry, right? And these became urgent issues that were calling me in a way to reflect a bit from a more embodied and the everyday aspects of war and liberation.
It's also very striking that in the book, these personal stories actually clarify much more the reality in the 90s in Kosovo, opposing to a usual history book. So the Albanian language, how it disappears from the urban life, how the city shrinks and becomes divided. So this ethnic division becomes much more clear in this way of writing. And also, when war is described in such an intimate and domestic reality of everyday life, you have a lot of aspects that are very universal, such as the aspect of bread. It comes many times in the book. For example, you describe the moment when there is shelling nearby, so your family starts to get up from the dining table, but your mom is very determined not to leave the table set. If I quote from the book, it's, "Bread is sacred. It is disrespectful to leave the table set after you finished. In war and in peace, in richness or poverty." Also, you describe the intrusion of your family's intimacy when the soldiers come and inspect the house, and one of them takes the freshly baked bread. Afterwards, nobody's hungry anymore. And you say in the book, "We enter inside and scan our rooms. Minutes before, the military was here, with their boots and their guns and their uniforms. They have seen where we sleep, where we play, and where we color." So it's like very intimate. And do you think that through these universal elements like these, that even those without war experience can relate to the book?
Bread is the quintessential element of food. It is also a sign of perseverance, liberation, but also resistance, because sourcing flour in the midst of the war, it is both an expensive and a dangerous enterprise. And the fact that there was freshly baked bread spoke to this very intimate form of resistance, because we were not going to pick up guns, but so sourcing flour and baking fresh bread to feed ourselves was the most supreme act of resistance that I could see, for instance. Bread is also important in the book because it flips the order of things in how family as a unit functions during wartime. Much like in many other parts of the world, the patriarchy and the patriarchal system of the family was quite overturned during the war, because what happened once everybody was inside the houses, you realize that the male subjects had next to nothing to do around the home because they did not know how to handle anything around the home. So again, like, even though our moms had left their jobs outside and we were all equally locked inside, they were the ones who were keeping the home economy and actually, mending for things, finding ways how to outsource certain tasks, how to organize certain divisions of labor inside the house, but also how to make sure that we eat enough without risking that there is nothing left for tomorrow. And this flip of authority and who is in charge at home changed drastically during the war. And I think this is how I first, got into contact with the very premises of what can pass for feminism, because you did see who actually keeps the bread on the table, to put it very brutally, and also in reference to the question itself.
As an architect reading this book, I noticed a very strong sense of space throughout it. Very small details like doors and ladders and the roof of your house, the holes in the walls through which you go from neighbor to neighbor, and spaces like the basement, which plays a very key role in the book. And then some street seems to shrink or seem too long. It is in a way as if these special elements become characters. How did this spatial dimension of war shape your memories, but also your writing?
This is clearly a reading from someone with background in architecture, because I did not think of my book as having that kind of contribution. So from a more political take, the city shrank as a space. First of all, it was very dangerous for you as an Albanian to be around, because you would be harassed by the police, you would be ridiculed, sometimes you would be taken into custody, for instance, if they caught you holding German marks as a currency. And this was only a currency that was not allowed to Albanian subjects, because the Serbian subjects could use this perfectly fine and, carry on with their lives. And then there were areas of the city where you were undesired. So you would not want to be there, because this interrogating look and this idea that you are unwanted here was very present. That also recreates a little bit the city of where you can go, where do you want to go? Are you in the mood to take a risk? Or are you in the mood to deal with all kinds of racist comments? Because unfortunately, as much as it is today, the anti-Albanian bigotry remained a staple throughout the 90s as well. And then what happens during the actual war, because the city changes itself during the apartheid-like period of the 1990s, but then during the war, also the home infrastructure changes, the neighborhoods changes, because the streets are filled with soldiers, they are filled with post blocks, you cannot go anywhere, there are no cars, so streets are not navigable by cars. But then again, even more so during the war, as an Albanian subject, you don't want to be seen in the streets. So what happened is that we had dug out holes in each other's walls with our neighbors, so you could essentially go for kilometers on end without actually going into the main street, because that was a safer way. And then we can also talk about how the inner regulation of the home functioned as well, because once we started to admit refugees, displaced persons coming from everywhere, that notion of what today passes for personal space was very blurred. This is also very common to more collective or community-based cultures, that the house or the architecture of the house, the whole purpose of having a house is in function to human relations, not the other way around. During the war, this became an aspect on steroids, because it was just essentially a space of accommodation, a space of collective survival. So it did not matter where the room started, where the room ended, as long as it kept us safe. And I think that also, indeed, after the discussion with you and your colleagues, it became clear that this symbolic and physical architecture of the war can be talked about, not just in relation to the book, but much like the bread, this is also a universal aspect of wars everywhere. Much like the bread, you also see it featured, for instance, in the books of Suleiman Adonia, when he talks about the refugee camps in Eritrea, then also the scarcity of food in many books on Bosnia, or those expired food products that were sent as quote-unquote foreign aid, so that we could survive on those. Both the element of bread and the element of space, you can trace it from Sudan to Kosovo to elsewhere, because these are the very essentials of survival.
Indeed. Thank you, Vjosa, once again. It was really nice, and I strongly recommend the book. It is incredibly well written. So thank you again, Vjosa.
Thank you very much for having me. I also always like to reiterate that all proceeds from the book go to the Children's Section Public Library in my hometown, Gjilan, in Kosovo. So thank you in advance for reading it.
Thank you.